Thank you for this opportunity to bring some attention to the Indigenous languages represented in Canada. I'd like to start off with an acknowledgement of the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and recognize that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Near the end of my presentation, I'll talk about the traditional language of the Métis people, which is a mix of French and Cree in many ways. The Michif word for Calgary is the same as Cree, I believe, in this case. It's Otosquanik, which means elbow, or his elbow, or her elbow, referring to the shape of a river here. And that turns out to be the same as the way the other Indigenous languages in this area, the traditional languages of Treaty 7, describe Calgary. So in Blackfoot, it's Mohkinsis, which again refers to somebody's elbow. In Tsotena, it's Gotsi Sa, which is Gotsi Sa, is also his elbow. And Iethka, or also called Iyahe Nakoda, Stony, it's also Winchinspa, which is again his or her elbow. Calgary, of course, is a Scottish Gaelic word. And so the connection with the Indigenous territory isn't as obvious as it can be in some other places. So if you go outside of Calgary, you'll find Kananaskis, which is named after a Cree warrior. Lake Minnewanka, a Nakota name. Okotoks and Ponoka are Blackfoot names, and so on. In neighboring British Columbia, Kamloops is from the Shuswap language. Coquitlam and Chilliwack are Halkomelem place names. The Okanagan language gave us Kelowna, Penticton, Osoyoos, Slocan, Nakusp, and so on. Alberta and British Columbia are extremely colonial names, but other provinces and territories do have Indigenous names, such as the Yukon, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Nunavut, and Quebec. And the capital cities of these provinces and territories also have Indigenous names. So, for example, Winnipeg and Saskatoon are from the Cree language. Quebec City is from the Mi'kmaq language. Iqaluit is from Inuktitut. Toronto is from an Iroquoian language. And Ottawa is from the Anishinaabe language. And so this gives an idea of the linguistic diversity in Canada. It turns out that 5 or 6 dozen Indigenous languages are spoken or signed in Canada, and that these represent over a dozen language families. This is a tremendous amount of linguistic diversity. And later in this presentation, I'll briefly present what these families are, the languages, and their status. But first, I want to give some important context for these languages. So we'll spend a few minutes thinking about the geopolitical and historical context of Indigenous languages in Canada. And then we'll think about the importance of these languages to Indigenous peoples, and we'll briefly consider efforts at documenting and revitalizing them. And then I'll walk you through a list of the languages, the point being to overwhelm you so that you get a sense of just how magnificently diverse the Indigenous linguistic heritage is in Canada. All right. So Canada is world-renowned for its official bilingualism, whereby English and French have, quote, equality of status and equal rights and privileges as to their use in all institutions of the Parliament and Government of Canada. This is from the Constitution Act of 1982. More broadly, quote, "The Government of Canada is committed to enhancing the vitality and supporting the development of English and French linguistic minorities as an integral part of the two official language communities of Canada, and to fostering full recognition and use of English and French in Canadian society." This is from the Official Languages Act, 1988. This official language policy is a point of pride for most Canadians, but it's a sore point for many Indigenous people. As I've just said, many dozens of Indigenous languages are spoken or signed in Canada, typically by direct descendants of the diverse peoples who inhabited the land for many thousands of years before Europeans arrived. To give just two examples, Europeans settled in British Columbia in the late 18th century, but there's archaeological evidence that Indigenous peoples already inhabited these territories 14,000 years ago. And Europeans settled in the Yukon in the 19th century, but there's archaeological evidence that Indigenous peoples inhabited the Yukon 24,000 years ago. Some of these languages extend beyond Canada's borders which are recent and problematic from an Indigenous perspective. But each of these languages is more tightly bound with the physical country than the twin official languages are. English and French are colonial European as well as international. By contrast, consider only this brief report from a couple of decades ago. "The voice of the land is our language" was the theme of the National Elders Gathering on Manitoulin Island in 1993. Throughout this week-long meeting, elders from hundreds of communities across Canada told us that Aboriginal languages are spiritually interconnected with the land. The understanding that you can't separate land from language is well documented for Indigenous peoples in Canada. Jeanette Armstrong, famed director of the Innoquin Centre, explained it this way: "Language itself comes from how the land expresses itself. Every language comes from the different interactions we have with the land." The American linguist and anthropologist Edward Sapir realized the same a century earlier, shortly after he'd begun working with some Nuu-chah-nulth people in their language. "So far as language is concerned, all environmental influence reduces at last analysis to the influence of social environment. In the case of the specialized vocabularies of the Nootka, that is Nuu-chah-nulth, it is important to note that it is not merely the fauna or topological features of the country as such that are reflected, but rather the interest of the people in such environmental features." In recent years, Denise Green was able to pick up this discussion with direct descendants of Sapir's Nuu-chah-nulth consultants. They confirmed and emphasized that their language reflects what dozens upon dozens of generations have noticed, thought about, and related to in their environment. Elements and features of their traditional territory are in their ancestral language precisely, quote, "because they have social, economic, ceremonial, and spiritual significance." The same is apparently true of all Indigenous languages in Canada. As Lilith scholar Lorna Wanostat Williams remarked, "With each one, the language comes and emerges from the land, and we have to respect that." And yet, to date, not a single Indigenous language has been recognized as official by the Government of Canada. This insult is heaped upon injury in Canadian history. The early French and British explorers and missionaries brought with them diseases which were new and therefore deadly to Indigenous peoples. Epidemics of smallpox, typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, measles, and so on, as well as confrontation, dislocation, deprivation, and so on, caused the Indigenous population of what is now Canada to plummet from perhaps 500,000 in the late 15th century to a mere fifth of that number by the late 19th century. Entire communities were decimated, along with their distinct dialects and languages. For instance, St. Lawrence Iroquoian, the province of Canada, which means village, vanished with its speakers in the late 16th century. The last of the Beothuk, who originally inhabited the island of Newfoundland, passed away in the early 19th century, along with their unique language. In the century between the 1880s and the 1980s, the Indigenous population bounced back again, growing to 500,000. But in the same period, the Government of Canada forcibly enrolled approximately 150,000 Indigenous children in church-run boarding schools away from their families. The goal was to assimilate them into Euro-Canadian society. As painstakingly documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in recent years, Indigenous children were forced to speak English or French, and they were shamed or even punished for using their own languages. Here's a brief telltale excerpt from the 528-page summary of the TRC final report. Michael Sillett, a former student of the Northwest River Residential School in Newfoundland and Labrador, told the Commission, quote, "Children at the dorm weren't allowed to speak their mother tongue. I remember several times when other children were slapped and had their mouths washed out for speaking their mother tongue, whether it was Inuktitut or Inuaimun. Residents were admonished for just being native." As late as the 1970s, students at schools in northwestern Ontario weren't allowed to speak their language if they were in the presence of a staff member who could not understand that language. Most were deeply affected by these and other experiences, and many eventually became unable to communicate with their own parents and other relatives who didn't speak English or French. Some also came to disavow indigeneity in general, further disaffecting them from their families and communities. In the end, the residential school system succeeded at teaching Canada's official languages to Indigenous children, and to a lesser extent at assimilating them into Euro-Canadian culture, if not society, by suppressing their own ancestral languages, cultures, and identities. Unsurprisingly, Indigenous languages in Canada are currently endangered, but in consideration of what generations of their speakers have endured, they can only be admired for their remarkable resilience and relative vitality. Quote, "Some of the earliest language activists were the children and students who, risking corporal or psychological punishment, continued to speak their languages in residential and boarding schools and at home with their families." It is indeed remarkable that in spite of the distress associated with using Indigenous languages, so many former students of residential schools succeeded in transmitting their linguistic heritage to their children and grandchildren. Former students of residential schools who have become language activists give credit to their own forebears, many of whom were themselves former students of residential schools. For example, Nora Wedson is a cultural coordinator who's charged with advising several levels of government, the Tlincon government, the Northwest Territories, and Canada, on how to use their respective powers in ways that respect and promote Tlincon language, culture, and way of life. Language is central to her work, and when I was last in touch with her, she had led the training of 25 Tlincon language interpreters, and she called on women at a National Indigenous Women's Summit to safeguard their languages. At a meeting with some peers a few years ago, she shared how she managed and continues to reclaim her language, in spite of spending 18 long and challenging years in residential school. Many younger Indigenous people, in turn, have come to view their sacred tongue as a sacred trust, their forebears' will and testament of cultural and historical survival. For instance, consider how Inuksukaki, Sandra Many Feathers O'Hara, who is a Blackfoot instructor at the U of C and also a longtime teacher at her Kainai Nation in southern Alberta. Consider how she describes her sense of duty and indignation in the Blackfoot language rap song, "We're Still Here." Perhaps even more compelling are Indigenous activists who didn't learn their heritage language as children because it was all too effectively extinguished in their parents or grandparents by the residential school system. In one of his books, my colleague Jürgen Meisel reminds us that, quote, "second language acquisition appears to be mission impossible for most teenagers and adults. Infants and very young children develop almost miraculously the ability of speech without apparent effort, without even being taught, as opposed to the teenager or the adult struggling in language classrooms without, it seems, ever being able to reach the same level of proficiency as 5-year-olds in their first language. Learners in a naturalistic setting do not fare much better, frequently even worse, in fact, as is demonstrated by the limited success of many immigrants who have acquired their knowledge of their new linguistic environment in the process of everyday communication without ever attending classes. Activists who have learnt and who continue to learn their Indigenous languages as teenagers or adults are thus uniquely dedicated individuals. For example, Karakwinhawi, Zoe Hopkins, a language teacher at Six Nations, which is the largest reserve in Canada, describes her own experience learning Kanyengeha, which is Mohawk, at the age of 35, essentially from scratch. Quote, I studied the language in an immersion setting for 2 years of full-time study. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was more arduous than earning my degree. I became an advanced mid-level speaker. According to a recent survey, second language speakers at Six Nations, like Karakwenhawi, are driven by the same family honor as native speakers, like Inusokaki above, and this sense of duty is evidently strong enough to sustain their language learning efforts. Quote, 100% of language learners who have become speakers indicated that they remember someone in their families who spoke Ongoihoeneha, and that this was a great source of pride for them. Informants stated that they wanted to honor, respect, and continue on the tradition throughout their family line of speaking Ongoihoeneha. That drive is described as follows by Susan Blight, an Anishinaabe artist and language activist from Couchiching First Nation in Ontario. Quote, there was a time when our people were criminalized, abused, and ridiculed when speaking Anishinaabe-Moin, but our language survived. We shouldn't forget that. Use it as a strength to go forward. Another galvanizing belief, which is less obvious and therefore more interesting, is that Indigenous peoples can't survive without their languages. As Kelselam, a language reclamation activist from the Squamish Nation, puts it, we either bring our languages back or we die. Kelselam himself began learning Squamish at age 19 from Vanessa Campbell, a fluent elder in his community. This dramatic statement of Kelselam can be understood in a variety of ways. The simplest being that Indigenous languages represent a crucial requirement of being Indigenous. As one speaker of Smalgiach put it, Smalgiach defines who we are as Tsimshian. It follows that if one ceases speaking Smalgiach, one ceases being Tsimshian. Indigenous peoples' language-based definition of themselves is not fully appreciated or understood by most Euro-Canadians. Canadians generally identify with particular symbols, such as the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the national flag, and with particular values, such as gender equality and human rights. Canadians also value language as part of their identity, but many, even native speakers of French, see it as less integral than symbols, values, and other points of pride. As Pat Shaw remarks, quote, certainly many independent, physical, social, economic, cultural, and ideological attributes would rank high above language itself in a native English speaker's definition of his or her identity. This may be because Canadians who are native speakers of English in particular have a rather utilitarian view of their language. Quote, English may be a vehicle for the expression of spirituality, of attitudes, beliefs, values, and perceptions of truth, of culture, of self-identification. But English is seldom considered by its speakers to be the essence of either their individual or collective identity. By contrast, many Indigenous citizens tend to regard their ancestral languages not only as integral but as core to their identities, as illustrated by Kelselam's and other statements above. Another good illustration is the motto, "We are our language," which is ubiquitous in Canada's Yukon territory. This phrase is commonly found in all 8 Indigenous languages of that territory, notably in a circular logo that is used by the Aboriginal Language Services and the Yukon Native Language Center. An even better illustration is the following official statement by the Assembly of First Nations, a national advocacy organization that represents 634 First Nations communities across Canada. Quote, language is our unique relationship to the Creator, our attitudes, beliefs, values, and fundamental notions of what is truth. Our languages are the cornerstone of who we are as a people. Without our languages, we cannot survive. As the statement implies, Indigenous peoples in Canada are passionate about their heritage languages for many reasons, including their lived experiences. People who lose their language often speak of a deep sense of loss of self, of loss of identity. The understanding that languages are vital, literally, to Indigenous peoples is reaffirmed by the First Peoples Cultural Council in a scrupulous report on the status of Indigenous languages in British Columbia, where the majority of languages happen to be spoken in Canada. Quote, "There is growing evidence of the link between a strong linguistic and cultural identity and well-being in other areas, including social and mental and physical health, a reduction in harmful behaviors such as alcohol and drug abuse and suicide, an increase in high school graduation rates, and other positive educational outcomes, and higher employment rates. The discrimination that First Nations continue to face in the outside world is more tolerable when they have a strong connection to their language, history, and lands." Especially compelling in this regard is a demonstration by Hallett, Chandler, and Lalonde 2007 that Indigenous youth's likelihood of committing suicide in British Columbia is inversely correlated to their use of Indigenous languages. The study authors conclude more generally that, quote, "Indigenous language use is a strong predictor of health and well-being in Canada's Aboriginal communities." Nora Wedson, already cited above, explains how knowledge of Indigenous languages helps the individual and the community. Her explanation ends in the Chinchon motto, "Be strong like two people." It urges Indigenous people to double up their inner resources by drawing on their traditional ways of knowing, being, speaking, signing, and listening, as well as on Western ways. The importance of Indigenous languages to both individuals and communities is reflected by countless revitalization and documentation efforts across Canada. Language revitalization is led by individuals at home, at school, at play, and so on. Community-level endeavors include immersion nests, junior youth language and culture camps, language study circles for youth, adults, and parents, home visits with elders, mentor-apprentice pairings, meetings and gatherings in the Indigenous language, and so on. Revitalization activities are generally positive and constructive for individuals and communities, so much so that they're deemed worthwhile even in cases where they're unlikely to succeed at returning a very critically endangered language to everyday use. Language revitalization also engages Indigenous institutions, such as language institutes, Indigenous education institutions, as well as local, regional, and national political organizations. For example, in December 2016, the Anishinaabe Nation, which comprises 40 communities across Ontario, voted to move forward a new jurisdictional and fiscal educational agreement with Canada, the largest proposal of its kind. A central goal of the new self-government agreement is to better provide Anishinaabe Anishinaabe language, to students, both on and off reserve. Moreover, Anishinaabe Nation communities are voting to move forward a related master education agreement with the province of Ontario, which will also stress the use of Anishinaabe. By contrast, the documentation of Indigenous languages in Canada, dictionaries, grammars, texts, recordings, corpora, archives, and so on, tends to be led by research institutions, which are largely non-Indigenous, though usually in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, and often in tandem with revitalization efforts. For instance, Innu-speaking communities and their institutions have collaborated with linguists at Memorial University and Carleton University in documenting how their particular dialect of Cree is acquired and used in Labrador and Quebec. This collaboration is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, like most documentation work in Canada, and it's resulted in revitalization activities and tools, training workshops, language curriculum development, Innu English-French dictionaries, mobile apps for smartphones and tablets, children's books, and online resources. Unsurprisingly, language projects at research institutions derive particular benefit from Indigenous faculty who are also integrated as local community members. For example, Peter Jacobs, an accomplished linguist formerly at the University of Victoria, was pursued and hired by Simon Fraser University, which is located on the shared traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam. As an active member of the local Squamish Nation and a fluent speaker of its official language, Dr. Jacobs is now able to work especially intensely and effectively on the documentation and revitalization of that Squamish language. Similarly, Frida Henakyu, who passed away in 2011, was a professor of Native Studies at the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Manitoba, who is celebrated for her analysis, documentation, and revitalization of a regional language, Plains Cree. A branch of the Saskatoon Public Library was recently renamed after her. Her legacy also lives on through her many books, such as Cree Language Structures, A Cree Approach, which has been reprinted 18 times. Through her many children, such as Dolores Sand, a famed teacher of that language, Plains Cree, and through her many former students and trainees. This brings us to the role of post-secondary institutions in facilitating capacity building in Indigenous communities. Certain programs in language documentation and revitalization are decades old, such as the Yukon Native Language Center at Yukon College, the First Nations and Endangered Languages program at the University of British Columbia, and the Canadian Indigenous Languages and Literacy Development Institute at the University of Alberta. Pertinent diploma and certificate programs are also offered at a dozen smaller colleges around the country. Such training programs have multiplied more recently in response to the call to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Quote, "We call upon post-secondary institutions to create university and college degree and diploma programs in Aboriginal languages." So for instance, Georgian College has a new diploma program in Anishinaabe revitalization. Six Nations Polytechnic has new programs in Cayuga and Mohawk, Kanyengeha. And the University of Saskatchewan has a new certificate and master's degree program in Indigenous language revitalization in collaboration with the University of Victoria. This second part of my presentation will list the many families of Indigenous languages in Canada. The smallest families, those with a single member, will be listed first. The larger families will then be listed in ascending order of speakers or signers. Mixed Indigenous languages, those belonging to more than one family, are described last. As in genetics, linguistic families are established on the basis of shared traits across languages. For example, Na-Dene languages are notorious for having classificatory verb stems. In particular, verbs that refer to the entities being at rest, such as standing, sitting, lying, in motion, for example, throwing, dropping, or falling, or manipulated, such as taking, giving, handling. Such verbs vary conspicuously according to the physical attributes and relations of the entities under discussion.